Hello and welcome back to another episode of Graduating Grief with me, Christy.
And me, May.
Today we're very lucky to be joined by University of Surrey lecturer Dr. Mark Shanahan, who is very kindly going to give us a lecturer's perspective on grief. So, Mark, from a university's perspective, what safety nets are there for students who are experiencing grief?
Well, grief is a natural process, and at some time during most students' time with us here at Surrey, they will experience an event in their life that will lead them into grief. It is very different for different people. The key for us is knowing about it. And that could be knowing when a student arrives and has had a close family loss and is living through that. It could be an event that happens while a student is here with us. Often it is a matter of differentiating between what is very, very natural. It is quite natural for people to lose their grandparents. Something happens in a close family while a student is with us. So losing a parent, losing a sibling. And for us, the absolute key is being aware of that. Many students will try and struggle on through grief without telling anybody. That's a very, very natural thing. You kind of think you don't want to bother us. It is a private issue. And it is something that you think is removed from your studies. Some people will go and talk to counselling, so I always get it the wrong way around. Is it welfare and well-being or well-being and welfare?
I think it's well-being and welfare at Surrey.
Well-being and welfare. So 3 or 4 times a year, I will get a message through about one of my students who has gone to see the well-being team, has maybe had a little bit of counselling, and with that team's agreement, and particularly with the students' agreement, the wellbeing team will let the academic team know. Normally they'll contact a student's personal tutor, and then again with the permission of the student, and it's only with the express permission of the student, the tutor will share that information about what a student is going through with their colleagues, particularly the teaching colleagues who'll be working with that student. Other people will go through the disability and neurodiversity team, and again, we will get something coming through, often quite late in the day, I have to say. There's something of a backlog of people seeing the neurodiversity team, for instance, and then anything that student wants to share with the academic team getting through to us. So never assume that the people on the staff side that you're working with know what's going on. And then there are lots of services that we can signpost to. I'm not a great one for signposting. I would much rather sit down with the student and talk, or more so, just listen. I will never just deflect and say, go off to counselling or go and see the student union sports team, whatever it may be there. On occasion, I've sat with the student and we've talked for a while, and then I've walked over to counselling with them. And I tend not to leave until at least they've been triaged and somebody has seen them there. And I know that I'm handing that student on to someone in good hands. As I'm not a counsellor, I have no particular skills in that area, but I've been a dad for 31 years now. And you do tend to pick up on when things aren't right and when people aren't in their natural state and when they're not happy. I'm a personal tutor, and we do get a little bit of training, and you look for what's different. So if the student who'd previously been noisy and abundant is suddenly very quiet and withdrawn, you take note of that. Or the student who may have been very quiet and serious and getting on with their studies suddenly isn't turning up, or is coming in drunk or high or hyper or just in a different state to normal. You look out for what's different. And then in my case, I would always want to have a conversation and just listen, which isn't always the case, but then it's keeping an eye more as colleagues in a team. So for me, I'm part of two teams. So whether it's the foundation teaching team or whether it's the politics teaching team, it's just saying, are you aware of so-and-so? I've just noticed they haven't been in for the last few weeks, or when they've been here, they've been wondering, like, they're clearly not paying attention, something's up. And generally we can put a picture together between the group of teaching staff, and then maybe we'll sit down with that student and find out what's going on. That's a very long and rambling up.
That's okay. I think it's really nice that, because there's a massive stigma around sort of at university, like students not being able to form sort of any sort of like relationship, I guess, with their lecturers, and people always say it's not sort of a one-to-one thing. So I think it's really nice, that you're actively doing that. But I have a question. Obviously, like you said earlier, you're not a therapist, you're not a counsellor, and obviously listening to a lot of like teenagers' problems, like life problems. How do you deal with that, like personally? Like obviously not like too deep, but like how do you deal with that? You know what I mean?
Sort of know what you mean. When I first meet my tutees for the first time, the first thing I always say is, I'm not your dad and I'm not your best friend, but I'm someone that I hope you can knock on my door and I will be a listening ear. I'll listen, try not to be judgmental, and if I can help, I will. And that is kind of what I would expect from personal tutors in the university, which is actually quite a difficult one, because we have something called a workload allocation model. And our hours that we work over the course of the year are divided up between research, teaching, and what's called admin. And admin might be that you're a head of department or a director of teaching and learning or a personal tutor, and they tend to be spreadsheeted hours. So what it means is that maybe people who aren't so emotionally switched on will still get a bunch of personal tutees. What I find with students is that students will naturally gravitate towards those of us who are a bit more interested in students as people. Often I find it is people who've got older kids, who've been through situations with our own kids. Not always. I have got some brilliant colleagues who are very young, who are only recently graduated as PhDs, but have that emotional intelligence to be able to understand when people are going through a situation that is tricky. And then it's just about giving time and space and listening. So for me, I've been through some really, really tough times. And actually what I find is I bring some of that experience to trying to understand what students are going through now. And students now are quite different from 5-10 years ago, from pre-COVID, and are very, very different from the student group that I was a part of about 312 years ago. So I don't try and be a student. As I said, I can't be matey about it, but I can maybe bring some experience and some understanding of what people are going through.
So you've spoken quite in depth about how, as a university lecturer, you've done this, but you have brought up in lectures a government task force, which I do believe you're on, for a duty of care towards students at university. Could you tell us a bit more about that, kind of its goals, its objectives, kind of where we are with it?
Yeah, I spent quite a long time in a windowless meeting room at the Department for Education just yesterday, going through the 9th task force meeting up in London. The HEMHIT, Higher Education Mental Health Implementation Task Force, has a very long name. And it came out of a Westminster Hall debate that happened last year into why there isn't a statutory duty of care for students. So if you were at an FE college, if you were at a further education college, the college would have a duty of care for you, built in by law, primarily because they deal with under 18 students. Mm-hmm. If you were at work, your employer would have a duty of care for you. So the University of Surrey, fine institution that it is, has a duty of care for me as an employee. it doesn't have a duty of care for you as students, not something that is statutory. So what we found was there was inconsistencies in practice across the sector between, and this is particularly aimed around mental health. So grief is something slightly different. It is a natural state. It is not a failing of mental health, but sometimes can lead to issues with mental health. So grief in itself is probably on the margins of what we're looking at, but we are looking at ensuring students have the safest journey through your study in terms of being cared for by the appropriate authorities within a higher education institution or by the NHS when things go wrong. So there were some stats that came out yesterday. So we've just issued our second HEMHIP report. And it says that only 5% of students arriving at university will declare a mental health condition. But at any time, the figure is something more like 22% of students. So more than 1 in 5 are struggling with their mental health. What we are trying to do is take a whole campus approach so that we can identify students who are struggling and identify them consistently, have the right processes so that non-clinical staff, and that could be anyone from accommodation staff, campus safety, through to the academic staff, through to the people you meet in the hive, all have the appropriate training to pick up when students are not in a good way. And that then is understanding and working more closely with the care services that are around. So the welfare teams, the counselling teams, mental health support teams that are around. It's about finding ways to bring best practice to those teams so that it's not necessarily costing more, but that we are using resources as well as we can. So maybe doing things a little bit differently. We've identified some best practices that are going to be rolled out. Some of that is around compassionate communication. I remember when I arrived at Surrey, one of the first things I came across was somebody being terminated. And it's just a terrible term. It's a term that comes from legal speak and IT speak being wrapped up. So people being suspended, people being terminated. It is fairly cold and callous language, often delivered by a machine-generated email. So there's no humanity involved in it. So one of the tools that we've launched in the last couple of weeks is a compassionate communication toolkit, and just making universities think about how do you communicate with students? When you're writing to them, what's the style and the tone? What kind of language do you use? When there is difficult news to share with people, maybe do that personally, or definitely do that personally, but who are the right people to do that? All of those kinds of things. There are a couple of other big areas that we're looking at. So the relationship between universities and the local not just mental health, the local NHS providers. Too many people fall in the gaps. We get to the point where universities are not skilled enough to deal with all of the issues that a student presents us with, but the NHS don't immediately pick it up. So how can we build closer, more seamless relationships with the local NHS? And we are also doing, or we're part of, a national review of student suicides, which is looking at how universities deal when everything goes wrong, when all of the processes fail and a student takes their own life. And that is a particularly hard one, a tricky one. I was with Professor Lewis Appleby, who's from Manchester University, who's leading on that programme, and he was with us in our meeting yesterday. And no university ever sets out to do harm, whether that's in prevention, in looking after students. It's at the point of crisis when things go wrong, or post-vention when they've gone very wrong. But most universities can do things better. So that particular work is looking at how we can do things better. There'll be a report on that in the spring. Our task force runs until May. It's including all of the big guns from the university sector, plus a couple of us who were there because of lived experience.
I think that's really good. I think that's obviously really helpful for uni students. But I'd say a lot of this that's being put in place, coming from uni students ourselves, there's a lot of students that are going through a lot of stuff mentally, whether that's with family or friendships or whatever it is. This is a bit of a rogue question, but what would your advice be to students that don't feel like they can come to, for example, say lecture or go to the Hive or whatever, because a lot of people feel like they can't, come forward, and it's like a sense of embarrassment. So what would your advice be if you feel like there's any students out there that can't come forward?
Two things I would say, and the one is the easy one, which is actually the hardest thing to do, which is talk to someone. Nobody should be on their own going through grief or going through any kind of mental ill health. We all have mental health. It's pretty fragile. And university, the huge change that you go through anyway, leaving home wherever home may be, to come to university is a massive, massive challenge. While we say you're over 18 and therefore you're adults, I know my adult self at 18 was hugely different from my adult self at 21, 22, that I did a massive amount of growing up through that time, to my adult self at 312, as I told you I was. Now, I mean, I graduated 40 years ago next year, so I've been around an awful long time and see this. And what I would say is that there is always someone who will listen, and there is always someone who can help. And it may not be your personal tutor. You may have a good relationship with your personal tutor, and understand that most of us will not be shocked by anything. We've seen it on a number of occasions. We've heard about it on a lot more occasions. There is very little that can shock us. But if it isn't your personal tutor, find someone who you're confident to talk to. And you don't have to say everything all at once, and you're not going to be judged. Sometimes it will just be somebody like me who will sit and listen. And whatever you want to say, and it might come out in dribs and drabs over the course of weeks. You might have that huge splurge now and be so relieved to get it off your chest. There are no silver bullets for help. That the world may be a better place just for opening up and sharing, whether that's the person in the next bedroom to you, maybe it's the person that you have a coffee with after lectures, maybe it is someone on the staff side that you talk to. But a huge step is just talking in the first place. After that, be aware that there are many, many sources of help. So whether it is from the Thrive program and sort of the stuff that goes on formally in the university, or it may be sitting down with a buddy or a mentor or just the person whose lectures you quite like and talking issues through. And often the issue that seemed to be the huge and unimaginable mountain of grief or worry for you can be broken down into a lot of smaller steps forward. So how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
But so, it's clear that there's much of a support network in place at the university. But does there become a time where you've kind of got to swap the hat you wear, so to speak, from being supportive to worrying about the student academically? So if the student was grieving and the process had become 2-3 months and you kind of kept seeing a fall academically, is there a time where you then have to kind of switch back modes, or how does that work?
Okay, there are a number of different circumstances. Every single case is individual. I say case. Every person, every student that you interact with is quite different, and there is a constant weighing up and judging of what's going on. And there's the huge difference between the student who just before every assignment sends through an email and says, "Oh, I'm dealing with a terrible situation," and those terrible situations tend to be about 5 paragraphs long in an email and are very, very detailed. And you know what? Those I often don't worry about too much. And it's an academic thing where grief, real or imagined, or natural sadness, and everybody is sad some of the time, is being used as a little bit of an academic crutch. And you deal with that student as an academic issue, and you talk to them and actually get beyond, oh, my sixth granddad has died in the last 2 years, because we did keep records of stuff. But the people who are using this as an excuse, not huge numbers do it, and it maybe makes it harder for people with real issues to feel that they can speak up. So there is a little bit of cynical edge in academia when we know that people are trying it on. Then you will get the people for whom the situation is very, very real. And if I would be very worried if it has gone to 3 months. Sometimes you find it's gone to 3 months because a student hasn't spoken up. And that this student who came in and seemed in that first personal tutor meeting to be reasonably happy, reasonably settled in. So you put them in that box at that point. Then you notice there's a gradual tailing off and things are happening. Hopefully, we will intervene, because there's a whole series of things that we can look at. So whether it is my Surrey attendance, my Surrey engagement, we can see how many times you've logged onto the modules. We can see the materials that you've read. This year is more difficult than ever before because there are just so many students. The university is not in a brilliant place financially, has taken in a lot more students. So whereas in a previous year I might have had 20 personal tutors, I've got 30, whereas I might have had a class of 50 this year. I've got classes of 8. So it's down to us to keep on top of this and to look at all of the measures that we can see of student engagement. If a student really isn't engaging and you find them, it's up and down to us to reach out proactively and find out what's going on. Up until last year, they used to see student success. So that was their job at the university. That's not happening this year. So it's down now to departments. So for say in the politics department, you might find that you've got Nikos emailing you, or you've got Nick as the program director emailing you, as well as your personal tutor. It is quite difficult if a student doesn't respond at all, but I think we are more aware than ever before that we just can't leave it, that we actually have to, in some form, get that student in front of us, sit there and really go through quite a methodical process of finding out what's at the root of this, what's wrong, what's happened, so that the person that we put in this box at the start of October is now down here, and what other steps we can take to bring you back. And that might mean, I don't know, just a little bit of extra coaching and support from the teaching team, or it might be saying, you know what, you really ought to have a break. Things aren't working now. Don't push yourself to think that you have to go through this like a sausage machine and out at the end of it in 3 years. Because for some students, that's just not going to be the best way. And actually taking time out, doing what you can to give yourself the self-care you need, and maybe coming back and having a go again in September is going to be far better than pushing yourself to beyond a point that you know you're comfortable and just watching your own performance dive. It doesn't have to be that way. We do not judge whether a student takes 4 years or 5 years or whatever to get through the program. What we want is for you to emerge as a graduate, as an expert in your subjects. That's what undergraduate study is, and it's going to be different paths and different routes for different people.
Definitely. And I'd also like to ask as well, as a I go to GSA, not the Surrey, like Uni of Surrey. Well, same thing, but not really. And at drama school, things can get proper intense, you know, like it can get really intense and people can be going through things and that sort of thing. And there are some amazing, you know, tutors and lecturers, if you will, that are definitely offer support. But what would your advice be again to GSA students that maybe feel like they can't, you know, maybe go to the things accessible in the campus, like Uni of Surrey campus?
It's a really interesting one. I take an example from a very, very different field. I was over in Jersey a couple of weeks ago talking to medical students over there. Jersey doesn't have a university, but the hospital teaches nurses, midwives, physiotherapists. It has doctors, students, medical students coming in from University of Southampton. They're all on these vocational courses, very much like GSA. You go into GSA not to be a corporate accountant at the end of it. You know you're going to work in the creative arts. They're all over in the hospital in Jersey, know that they're going to work in medicine at the end of it. And there is an additional pressure. Often it is a myth that says, if I declare that I'm in trouble, that my mental health is not as good as it should be, I will be judged and I won't get those jobs at the end of it. I won't be allowed to be a doctor. I won't be allowed to be in that fantastic Royal Shakespeare Company. Hey, be in the Royal Shakespeare Company, but be in that RSC production. Don't work like that. Look at the profession. Look at the trials and tribulations that run through the creative arts. Everybody works towards finding their own settled state of mental health, and there will always be support around there all the way through. The pressure should no more be on you as a GSA student than on any other student at Stag Hill. The pressure should no more be on the students that I was talking to over in Jersey, who are working in a hospital, than on any other student. We have very few mature students these days because of changes in funding. So you are nearly all young people at quite a vulnerable, but also extremely exciting stage in your life. And you should all have access to the same support. We know you're not the fully formed final objects yet. Your brains don't stop growing until you're 25. And that is a clinically provable fact that our new wonderful University of Surrey Medical School no doubt would have a lot to say about. So I think one of the most insidious parts of this is peer pressure, that you're seeing a lot of GSA people around you, wonderfully successful. You're seeing those wonderfully Instagrammed lives where everything is perfect. The reality that maybe we see from the other side is that for the vast majority of people, things aren't perfect. And not everybody is leading that Instagram life all of the time. We all have down moments. It is natural for us to be sad and unhappy. Where we as staff need to be able to step in and offer the support is when it goes beyond that I'm having a bad day or a bad week to it becoming the more natural state for the student to be off their game all the time. Then something is wrong. And we all know that people going through depression or anything like that, they're not depressed all the time. Nobody is, say, if you're going through grief, you're not down in the bottom all of the time, every day. And sometimes it is us having to make others aware of that we're happy too. Lovely things happen in our lives too. But sometimes you don't want to be the life and soul. And maybe sometimes that's when a friend in whatever form has to step in.
So just to round off then, Mark, if you could just give one last bit of advice to students who are grieving. We've said a lot about talk to someone. Is there another point, one last solid point you'd like to make?
Let people around you understand how you're feeling. Understand that. So I lost my son coming up to 7 years ago. that pain is very raw. It's still there every day. But what I don't want is the other people around me dragging me back to that point 7 years ago when he died. So I've built my various walls and constructs, and I have people who I can talk to when I know that I'm not in a particularly good frame of mind. But I also know that 70-80% of the time, I'm having a good time. Life is pretty good. Grief is a bastard and grabs you in the most horrible way at the most inopportune moments. And maybe it's just making those people around you understand that sometimes that might happen, but it doesn't mean you're going to be like that all the time. And do not walk around as if any of us are Keir Starmer's Ming Vase. We're reasonably normal people too. But sometimes just be that little bit understanding.
Well, Mark,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mark, you've been absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Advice. I think it's really good that you come on this podcast because this is mainly what students listen to. So it's nice to know that students will know where to go if they need support, for sure.
Dr. Mark Shanahan.
Please, yeah, can I just say, I don't want 16,500 people outside my door. The corridor is just not long enough.
You have got quite a cramp office, haven't you, Mark?
You have the whole uni outside.
Terrible office. Terrible office. A very dark corridor. Yeah. Okay, good to speak to you both.
Thanks
Absolutely
so
wonderful.
much.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Graduating with Grief with me, May.
And me, Christy. Why do we do that?
I keep doing it twice. If this has caused any offence or upset, there'll be stuff in the description for support for that. But yeah, that rounds up this episode, and we should have another one out for next week. Hopefully.
We're hoping. Also, a very special thank you to Dr. Mark Shanahan for giving us his time, especially on a Saturday at 10 a.m.
Yes.
We apologise as well for the state of the recording. Storm Dara.
I thought it was Storm Darragraph, but it's not.
As we now know, Storm Dara has caused some issues at the University of Surrey with the internet.
Yeah.
But we think it went well.
Yes, we hope it went well, and we hope that it was clear that there is support for everyone that is on campus at University of Surrey.
Completely. And with that, thank you for watching, and goodbye.
Thank you.